everybody. Welcome back. We are going to have episode 2 in a short series Dustin and I are doing on the history and prophecies of Israel. So last week we did a little intro, and this week we're going to launch into those histories and prophecies. But I have a funny little joke. Dustin and I have talked about this many times, and we know that this can be really controversial because a lot of scholars disagree on the rapture and different parts of eschatology. Some of it we all agree on, and some of it we don't. So we just want you to know that you should be studying these things and searching the scriptures to see if this is true. If you disagree with us, we're okay with that. We still love each other, and we're not going to be offended if somebody has a question or if you have a topic you want to discuss and share with us. We're open to that. But I want to do my knock knock joke. Knock knock.
Who's there?
Nagano.
Nagano, Japan?
Not going to know when Jesus comes back till he gets here.
Real funny. Ha ha ha.
All right. Now that we all know that we can joke about these things and everybody doesn't have to be in agreement with us, we can move on. I just thought that was funny. So back to serious notes. History and prophecies of Israel. You want to take us through a brief history? Because I know we could spend hours on this and it would be very interesting. And I love this subject. And I have spent hours listening to the history of Israel. But for purposes of our audience today, take us through a brief history of like the Old Testament Israel.
Yeah, you're right. There's so much history there that we could go through. We probably, if we started now, we might finish by the time Jesus comes back.
Wow, that's pretty good.
So it all starts, as we mentioned in our previous recording with Abraham. God called Abraham. Why did he pick him? We don't know why God picked him. It's like he chose him. God is sovereign. God chooses who he wishes. So he chose Abraham. He also chose Israel. When he chose Jacob, he renamed Jacob Israel. But if we start with Abraham, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed through Abraham. And then he reiterates that promise to Jacob, whose name he changes to Israel. So that's the original history of Israel going way, way back. And there are lots of things like we're not going to talk about here. You can go read your Bible and go read about the empires and, the kingdom under King Saul, and then David comes in, and then you get Solomon, then you have a divided kingdom, and then they go into apostasy and all this stuff that's all prophesied before it happened in the Bible. Deuteronomy lays out very succinctly, I can't say it right, succinctly, the basically timeline for Israel all the way from before the Exodus all the way down up until modern times. It's all there, even into modern times and beyond where we are now. So Israel does have a long history, but there's a big gap in that history because of things that happen. Because when Jesus, we talked about prophecy a little bit the last time as well. Jesus made a prediction because remember he was talking, when he's given there's two versions of him talking about his return, or there's a difference between the accounts. And in one of the accounts, in Matthew, it's clearly in the daytime, and it's clearly, Matthew 24, and it's clearly to a select audience. When he gives the discourse in Luke, people think they're the same. They're not. Go read them yourself. As Pam said, be a Berean. Go read Acts 17:11. Test these things for yourself. I'm not making this up. It's my understanding of the way the Bible reads, but you read it for yourself and you'll see if you really put them side by side, Matthew 24, and you put Luke 21 side by side and read them, it's not the same account. But in Luke, they asked Jesus a question about because he's talking about the temple. And in there he says, not one stone will be left up on another that will not be taken down. Well, the interesting thing about this, I know this is a little bit of an aside, but the interesting, very, very interesting about this prophecy that Jesus made, whenever Rome sacked Jerusalem in 70 AD, that did come true, where there was not one stone left upon another. However, what Josephus records, he was a historian in that time. Josephus records that when the Romans came into Jerusalem to sack it, and it was already under siege, there was an order sent from Rome to desecrate the temple. You remember, you may or may not, the Maccabees, and that Daniel talks about the first abomination of desolation. When the first abomination of desolation happened, in Daniel's, it was after Daniel's time, but in that Old Testament period with the Maccabees, the whole thing, that's where Hanukkah comes from. But anyway, I'm getting too much to the side here. So that was the first abomination of desolation. But Jesus said it'll happen again. And some people say, well, it happened in 70 AD. Well, no, it couldn't have, because it could have if the events would have unfolded, because the Roman emperor sent word to Jerusalem, say, put a pig on the altar in the Holy of Holies and sacrifice it. That word was sent. One of the Roman generals that got that word that was in Jerusalem basically said, disobey that order. Don't do what the emperor said.
So this is in Josephus, this part.
Yep, Josephus talks about this.
Josephus recorded that this message was sent and it didn't happen. So part of, just for clarity, the part of the Olivet discourse that happened was that the temple was torn down.
Not one stone will be left upon,
but the actual sacrifice of the pig on the altar of the Holy of Holies was prevented.
The abomination of desolation was prevented.
Okay. So you're saying that that's going to be part of the second time.
Correct.
When the next temple it doesn't exist right now gets torn down.
Because they couldn't, they wanted to do it. Rome wanted to desecrate the temple the same way the Greeks did with the Maccabee revolt. But they weren't able to, because the general basically disobeyed the emperor. I don't remember which the emperor was then. Was it Nero? It may have been Nero. I can't remember who the emperor was. It may have been right after Nero, but they disobeyed the order. Well, the emperor dies in the meantime before the message even got there for everybody to have. And so basically the general didn't get killed as a result of that. But Jesus' words got fulfilled, because what happened is the Jews that were in Jerusalem, because he said those who in Judea flee
to the hills, and they did.
And they did. But those priests and stuff went in the temple and barricaded themselves inside, and the Romans threw torches in there. Instead of being able to desecrate the temple, what was the temple made out of? What was it mostly made out of? Gold. There was gold.
So they wanted that gold.
They wanted that gold. So that what they had to do, because they burned down the temple, they had to take that temple stone by stone, just like Jesus said, to get that melted gold off of the stones so that they could reclaim that gold, just like Jesus said.
Okay, so we have an account in Matthew where Jesus was warning them at his time, the near future. In Luke, that was the Luke passage. In the near future, which turned out to be 70 AD, this is going to happen. The Christian Jews knew to run for the hills, and they were saved because of it. And we know that because of Josephus. Okay, so just wanted to clarify that. And then just to circle back around, the reason why you're making this big point about Matthew 26 and Luke 21, because
24.
a lot of 24, thank you. A lot of pastors teach those as if it's the same account, and it has been taught that way. And a lot of scholars disagree about this, but I like the point that you're making about there's some discrepancies, and so we need to search out why these things, and it causes a lot of confusion about end times things, because part of it has happened and part of it hasn't. And we're going to get to that, because we're going to talk about in the next episode, or the next, one of them, when the next abomination of desolation happens, and when the pig is going to be slaughtered into the Holy of Holies.
The next Holocaust will happen before that happens.
We can't get ahead, though. We're going to stay in chronological order. Okay,
you are correct.
We get excited, so we can go into places that get us bogged down. So,
and just one quick aside, those passages in Luke and Matthew, I'd been taught for years they were the same. Until one day somebody challenged me and go through them, mark them, write them out side by side, the accounts, and look for the differences in the account. When they happened, who the audiences were. They were very different audiences. It was not the same event that was recorded. And so when my eyes were open to that, I started to see a new area into the prophecy that I never saw
it
before.
helps us fit pieces together that you'll see as we move along. This will become more and more important along the way, is helping clarify some tensions in eschatological discussions where debates happen and stuff. So you'll see more about that. But I don't want to stay on this point too long because we have a lot of history to cover.
Right.
So lead us into the next phase. What was after that for Israel?
After 70 AD, as Jesus, as the Bible prophesied, Jesus, I think, may have said it, they were led captive into all the world. So basically got dispersed globally.
It's called the diaspora.
The diaspora of the Jews happened. So they were spread out all around the world after this. A lot of them ended up in Russia, they ended up in Europe, various places, mostly Russia and Europe. And I guess some of the Ethiopian Jews obviously ended up in Africa. So some of that kind of stuff happened. But that period of time, it lasted a lot longer than people thought it would. But all of those prophecies that we talk about with end times, there's one piece for all those centuries that the church would watch, and even in, Polycarp and some of these guys in like the, first and second century of the church were watching for, because they kept thinking, well, he says it's imminent, the rapture is going to happen. But the problem was, Israel was not in the land, and the requirement for Jesus to return, it's clearly laid out in Scripture, and we can get to that, is he will not return until the Jews, not the Gentiles, the Jews cry out, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And that's in Zechariah. And as a result of that, Satan, just like he did to stop Jesus' first coming, Satan has made war against the Jews since then. Really, before then, even in Abraham's time, once he saw God's plan start to unfold, he started persecuting and tormenting the Jews. And he's tried to wipe them out, because if he could wipe out every Jew, he could make God into a liar.
So he pulls a fast one ever so often to try to derail this process, going way, way back. So
Esther, yeah. He tried to kill them all then.
Yeah. And then
Moses with the babies.
And then Herod, when Jesus was born, tried to kill the babies. So after Jesus prophesied about the abomination of desolation, then the diaspora, where the dispersion that happened, because we won't go into who was the empires and stuff. You can read in world history who took over when, and Rome and all that. So there were lots of different kingdoms that ruled over Israel, and eventually they all dispersed. So then bring us back to kind of modern history, and I think it was the late 1800s. What happened?
So
what did we start to see that we hadn't seen for 2,000 years?
So during the late 1800s, the Ottoman Empire lasted from the 1500s up until 1917.
And that, just briefly, what is that?
The Ottoman Empire was a split off of the old Roman Empire. Remember, you had the eastern arm of the Roman Empire, the eastern arm, and you had the western arm of it being like Rome. But remember, the eastern arm was like Constantinople, in what is now modern day Turkey. So the Ottoman Empire was that whole area of the world, and they dominated. The Muslims dominated that area of the world. But then in the late 1800s, the Ottoman Empire started to weaken because the British were rising up and establishing their dominance in the Middle East. And in the late 1800s, as the Ottoman Empire was falling, there was what was called the first migration of the Jews back to Israel started happening from Russia in around late 1880s. There was a large number of Russian Jews that moved back to what is now called Israel, the Holy Land. We'll call it the Holy Land. They came back to there.
Because it wasn't established as a state of Israel or a country, so
there was
call
no
it the Holy
state.
Land.
Right.
So they just came into that land that wasn't really...
and Jerusalem was rubble because it had been completely sacked.
From 2,000 years ago.
Yep.
So there was not a lot happening in that region. It was kind of desolate land. It wasn't deemed as fruitful or inhabitable. It had just come under so much decay in that time.
And that's why so much
So no
of the
one wanted to
church-
be there.
Yep. And that's why so much of the church for centuries said, oh, those prophecies are spiritual, because Israel's never going to be in the land again. And then all of a sudden, this stuff starts happening. It's like this flower starts blooming in the late 1800s. And they have what's called the first Zionist Congress in 1897, where more Jews started coming in. And Jews mostly from Russia and Poland and other parts of Europe started coming in. And the Ottoman Empire fell in basically 1917. The British basically did a conquest on the Ottoman Empire. And so the British had now brought down the Ottoman Empire. And when the British did that, there was a foreign minister in Britain named Lord Balfour. You may have heard of Lord Balfour and the Balfour Declaration. Lord Balfour made a declaration to establish a Jewish national homeland for Israel. And even though that was agreed to, those in charge above him betrayed the whole thing and stopped the whole thing. And as you move into the 20s, more Jews were still trying to come in. And we get after World War I, and more Jews were trying to come in. And Britain in 1922 started trying this whole peace process, as we call it today. They had what's called the Mandate of Palestine. And basically, the League of Nations got together, and they were going to set up. So this is where this whole thing starts in modern times. The whole fight goes back to Jacob and Esau. But the modern times, the whole thing starts here in the 20s, where Britain going back on their word and doing all kind of chicanery along the way. But Britain created what's called the Mandate for Palestine. And they were going to create a land for Israel, for the Jews, and they were going to set up another region for the Arabs, because the Ottoman Empire had fallen. And
okay, I'm going to stop you real quick. Just I know in the last podcast we mentioned Arabs too and Palestinians. Just real quick, tell us how those terms can be confusing and interchangeable sometimes.
So the Arab, it is a more generic term that we use. Palestinians is another term
that started about this time.
Yeah, because they were just called Arabs or Bedouins. There was a more generic term. Okay. And the term Palestinian, actually, if the people that call themselves knew what the connotation was when that name was coined by the Romans way back when, it was a bad thing.
A derogatory term.
It was a Philistine. It comes from the word Philistine.
Okay. Thank you. I just want to make sure we covered that because it can be confusing.
So basically, the Mandate for Palestine, they're going to create two lands, Transjordan, and they're going to create Israel. And both of them were pretty large countries. Transjordan would take up most of Syria, but it was bigger than the Jewish homeland.
That was being proposed.
3/4 of the land they were giving for Transjordan, and 1/4 of the land for Israel. It doesn't seem fair to me, 3/4 for one group and 1/4 for the other, but Israel agreed to it. They said, yeah, that works for us. But the Arabs said no. They wanted all of the land. And so this kind of starts this whole period in the 20s and 30s. We get into World War II. The Holocaust, and during World War II, the Jews are trying to flee from Germany and Europe to the Middle East, and they're trying to Britain's still ruling all of that, and they're trying to get permission to go. All of a sudden, Britain starts blocking them, and so Britain and it's hard to basically say this, but Britain was heavily responsible for at least in part, for 6 million Jews dying in the Holocaust because they would not let them leave so that they could go and migrate to Israel to live in peace. See, the Jews, when they realized, because they were persecuted for millennia, because they get blamed by lots of groups, including the Catholic Church, saying they crucified Jesus. Well, they really didn't. The Romans did. But they get blamed for it. And because of that, they have been heavily persecuted
Yeah, I
over
think
the
there's
centuries.
a point of miscommunication or misunderstanding a lot of times for like currently, like in our lifetime, in our parents' lifetime, we've seen the church support Israel. But before World War II, mostly Jews were hated.
Yes.
And Jews were at odds with most people groups for various reasons and betrayed multiple times by the United States, by Great Britain, by everybody really. When you kind of boil down all these historic events of Israel doing different things to try to create their state and their homeland, how they've negotiated throughout the years. So I know you mentioned one time, and there are multiple other times you're going to get to.
Yeah, so Jordan got established. We know Jordan isn't a nation today,
But that's not the same as Transjordan, right?
it's mostly because Transjordan encompassed a lot of Israel that we know now as Israel. Israel takes that back from them in some wars that are coming up that we'll talk about. But basically, the Arabs went ahead and did their thing, but they basically, the world did not support Israel. And one thing you mentioned though about the church, the evangelical church as at large in the 20th century, yes, is a big supporter of Israel for the most part. The Catholic Church, going 20th century and even back, is still not a proponent of Israel. There's a lot, and there are a lot of churches don't either that teach the theology that church has replaced Israel, which we can get into it another time. Because that's a whole subject unto itself.
Well, I thought it was interesting. I didn't know until recently that Hitler was considered himself Catholic, and he was never excommunicated from the Catholic Church, even after all these atrocities. But I find that interesting.
Yep. So World War II happens. World War II ends. There have been, we mentioned that they've tried to make peace in the Middle East. There have been a total of 5 times that first one we mentioned before in the 1920s, where they tried, they were going to give 80% of the land to the Arabs and 20% to the Jews, and the Jews said, "Yeah, we'll take that." Arabs rejected it. This also started a violent rebellion because the reason they started trying to divide the land up, the Peel Commission in 1922 went out to figure out why is there so much unrest. And they figured out that these two groups, the Jews and the Arabs, were basically at odds with each other. And they concluded, the Peel Commission did, that a 2-state solution was the answer. One for the Jews and one for the Arabs. And so, in the 20s, they offered that and the Arabs rejected it. And then 10 years later, we come to 1940, not from 20s, but we come up to 1947, right before the nation of Israel is established. The British, because the Jews had gone through so much in the Holocaust. It's horrible. 6 million Jews dying.
1 in 3, right?
Yeah.
1 in 3 Jews died.
And the next Holocaust will be worse, unfortunately. But so in 47, Britain asked the United Nations, say, "Hey, let's look at this again. Here's the Peel Commission report that we came up with." And the UN said in November of 47, we're going to create 2 states. We're going to have an Arab state and a Jewish state. And the Arabs said no. Even though they got a lot more land than Israel, and they were giving Israel even the lesser quality land, they said no. So Arabs reject it. This time, though, after they rejected it, they launched an all-out war on Israel. Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria all attacked Israel. And Israel, by the grace of God and by miracles that we can't talk about here because there's too many, Israel, against all odds, sent them running with a tail between their legs.
So they weren't even an established nation, but they had miraculously formed an army that the Lord blessed.
Yes, and some of the planes,
that's phenomenal.
Some of the planes they used were like so antiquated, yet they supernaturally would be able to travel longer distances. There's all kinds of crazy miracles around that stuff. So, they basically, Israel won, and Israel said, you know what? We tried. We're done. You attack us. We're going to form a nation. We're going to establish the nation of Israel again in modern times. And David Ben-Gurion, who was decided to be the first prime minister of Israel, they had already voted. The Zionist Congress, I guess, had voted him in. This is well before the Knesset. And he got up on the stage, and you can go watch this video on YouTube because it's out there. I was surprised that it was out there, but I found it the other day, and you can go watch him go through, and he reads, what is it, Isaiah
66:8.
He reads Isaiah 66:8. And that verse, I won't go to it right now. You can look it up. But that verse basically says, can a nation be born in a day? And he reads that scripture and he declares that yes, Israel, and that verse is about Israel, and he declares that Israel is reborn. And he also reads out of Ezekiel with the dry bones and says that that is a fulfillment of this prophecy.
Okay, so that's pretty incredible. Just want to pause right there because so you have a desolate land that was the worst part of any land deal that was negotiated up to this point. This army that didn't even exist, and you had a group of people that call themselves Jews that were dispersed, the great diaspora 2,000 years ago, and their language was literally dead.
Yep.
It'd be like Latin today. It's spoken
Hebrew was dead
on occasion, but no one spoke it in their homes.
But in the 1800s, when that whole thing originally started, they basically started trying to revive the language. But now it is the primary language in Israel.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Prophesied too. I think it was in Zephaniah. I have to look it up, but it's in the Bible. It talks about the language being revived after being dead, so it's a fulfilled prophecy in modern times.
So we have this country that had no borders, no way to interact on the world economic system because the land was desolate. They had virtually no army, no language. They're pretty much nothing. And then miraculously, all of a sudden, God breathes on this people group.
Well, he always had breathed on them. They've always been look at Einstein, go back before, before Israel was established. Einstein was a genius. He was Jewish. A lot of people don't know he was Jewish. Oppenheimer was Jewish. So you have these Jewish scientists that have come up with some of the most amazing things.
Yes, well, I just mean particularly this time period regarding building this nation in history, that there was a specific turn that happened around these events because for 2,000 years, nothing had happened. And regarding Israel and these prophecies from of old, these ancient prophecies. So now we see this all happening, and the significance of it is pretty overwhelming when you realize, I get chills when, you think about this prime minister declaring this prophecy basically is fulfilled today. And they all of a sudden in the 40s, now they have a great army, these dry bones, they come to life. I imagine the Lord of the Rings scenario where the dry bones come to life. And then the language and the establishment of was that when the Knesset and the prime minister, all of that was, so they had this structure, governmental structure in place now. So then what happens?
Before we go to where we finished in 48, whenever they defeated all those armies and they could have just claimed all that land, they're like, nah, we would rather have peace. So what Israel did was they took a small piece of the Holy Land, but they gave the West Bank and East Jerusalem back to Jordan.
Known as Gaza?
No, not.
Oh, East Jerusalem.
East Jerusalem and the West Bank. They gave that to Jordan.
And so Gaza, not yet.
Not yet. So then, fast forward, there's some time where there's chaos in the 50s, but Israel's constantly fighting against them. In 1967 is when this big third event happens. And a lot of people probably know about this because, remember I told you in 48, they reclaimed part of the land, but they didn't get Jerusalem. They gave that away. And they didn't have the West Bank. They gave that away. But in 1967, again, Israel was just minding their own business. They're trying to nation build, getting their crops and all, and trying to reestablish themselves. In 1967, it's known as the 6-Day War. Israel didn't start any of these wars. Egypt and Syria and Jordan decided, nah, we don't want Israel in this land. They attacked Israel in 67. It's known as the 6-Day War because you think Israel had their tail between them running with their tail between their legs in 48. 67, they really had them running with their tail, but 6 days this war took. Again, lots of miracles. And at the end of this war, they took back Jerusalem, they took the West Bank, and they took the Gaza Strip. So now the Sinai Peninsula was now under, because Egypt was part of that mess too when they attacked them. So Israel took, you fight us and try to kill us, we're going to take land from you. That's the way, war works. You get spoils of war. So 67.
So they took back those places. Israel.
They took back those places, but then Israel did the craziest thing. They said, because they had Jerusalem back in their possession. They had the Temple Mount. And Ariel Sharon, which is really interesting because he ended up not being such a great leader when he became prime minister, but Ariel Sharon at one time, back in 67, he was the first paratrooper to land on the Temple Mount during the war in 67. And he was the very first one on the Temple Mount. When he landed on the Temple Mount, he said, let's build the temple because we have our land back. It's time to rebuild the temple. But again, Israel wanting peace said, no, we'll forego that and give the Temple Mount back.
And this was what
to
year?
Jordan, 67. So they gave they held the Temple Mount for like 2 weeks and then gave it back. And so this new territory that they captured, including the Gaza Strip, Israel, again, wanting peace, they said, let's give the West Bank to Jordan. Let's give Gaza to Egypt in exchange for peace. They just defeated these. It's crazy. They just defeated them. And they said, let's give this to them. And then around this time, people started referring to themselves. People argue about this, but people started referring to themselves as Palestinians. And they said, no, we want our own state. And Yasser Arafat and some of these other people come into the picture here. And so the Arab League met in Sudan and issued the 3 no's. Everybody should remember this. Because Israel always wanted peace. That's what people really need to remember. Israel did not start any of these fights. And so when they tried to work out a deal for a 2-state solution, they said no. And the 3 no's were no peace with Israel, no negotiations with Israel, and no recognition of Israel as a nation. The 3 no's.
Okay, I'm confused because I thought that was when Clinton had the summit.
This is before all of that. This is 67.
3 no's before that. Okay.
3 no. Arafat said the same thing later, yes.
Okay.
But the 3 no's came in 67 when Israel offered land for peace the third time. So, we know what happened after that. The Yom Kippur War in 73. Israel thought things were fine and they still were trying to make peace. In 73, on Yom Kippur, the holiest day on the Jewish calendar, if you remember back to the Old Testament, that was the most holy day. That was the only day the high priest could go into the temple, into the Holy of Holies, and offer the sacrifices for the people. So it was a very solemn holy day. Now, obviously, they couldn't do that because they had no temple, but that was a Sabbath as well, and the Arabs attacked them again.
And so particularly the Jews were vulnerable on that day because they abstain from communication, telephones, and electricity, that kind of thing.
And that's the same thing that happened
So they didn't listen to the radio. They didn't get... So a lot of people didn't know then it was also October 7th, I think, back there, 6th or 7th on Yom Kippur.
Right in there, yep.
And then this year it was like 50 years to the day. The same thing happened. Same thing. A lot of people didn't have their phones on, didn't know what was going on. So it's interesting just in because they're more vulnerable on that day.
Yep.
So 1973.
So 73, they
how long
attack
that
them
war
again.
last?
It was a longer war.
Like 3 weeks, I think.
Yeah, about that. And that is when they took the Sinai Peninsula, all of it, because they had just taken Gaza in the 6-Day War. But that is when they took, because Egypt, again, attacking them in 73, that's when they took all of the Sinai
Israel
Peninsula.
won the war, but they allowed the land of the Sinai Peninsula.
They've never lost a war in modern times.
Okay. I just want to make clear that you're saying they and them. Like,
right. No, that's good.
So, So they won. They didn't have to, but they gave Sinai Peninsula.
Not right away. There was got to remember the date. Basically in, where was it? Let's see. 79, Menachem Begin was Prime Minister of Israel. He had a meeting with Anwar Sadat of Egypt. Sadat was Prime Minister of Egypt, or President, I'm not sure which, but he was a leader. They had a meeting, and they both won a Nobel Peace Prize because Israel established a peace treaty with Egypt. They gave them back the Sinai Peninsula, except for Gaza, because Gaza was supposed to be reserved to create a state for what we call the Palestinians. And then time marches on beyond that.
Okay, so come on up to 1994. They had, until this point, they had Sinai, and there's Gaza, just like it has been. So what happened at the Oslo Peace Accord in 1994?
So in 1994, Arafat and who was the Rabin, I think was Rabin the president of Israel then?
In 1992, yeah, I have a note.
So Rabin was the president of Israel, and Yasser Arafat represented the Palestinians, because Israel and Egypt made peace, so that's a different thing. But they're again Israel trying to, they want to live in peace, and they were having all this unrest from what were called the Palestinians, and they decided, okay, we just give away let them have Gaza. We'll let them establish their own nation there, because they've had so much pressure from the world. They didn't have to give the land away. They won it fair and square, but they chose to trade land for peace. And so the Oslo Accords were signed, and it was supposed to establish a two-state solution, basically with the Palestinians and the Israelis. It was going to give the West Bank and Gaza. It was going to give them self-governance over. Israel wasn't giving them a state yet, because they wanted to prove themselves that they weren't going to act like children, basically, and perform terror attacks like they had been doing for years. And so they basically let them self-rule Gaza and the West Bank, so Jericho and some of those areas. They handed over and let them control that. So that was part of the Oslo Accords. But the thing is, they could not, even though they were meeting and discussing those things, they could not get to a final position, because the problem was where is it? Actually, it was before Oslo. Before Rabin was president. It was in 2000 when there was a meeting at Camp David with Arafat, and Bill Clinton oversaw this thing. Or no, not in 2000. Bill didn't oversee. Let's see. Bill Clinton did oversee that. That's right. So Bill Clinton oversaw this, and Bill Clinton is quoted, and you can go look this up. He said Arafat was here for 14 days, and he said no to every single thing Israel offered in exchange for peace. He wanted more. He wanted more land, and Arafat's dead now. But he's been quoted.
Okay, I want to just catch up real quick. Okay, so we had the Oslo Peace Accord in the early 90s, and they gave more away.
Yep.
And then a few years later, in early 2000s, we have Bill Clinton as the president of the United States.
He was there both times. He was in 94 and in 2000.
Okay, so, but he hosts the leader of Israel, who was who?
Barak, Ehud Barak,
okay, and
was
then
prime minister.
Arafat.
And Arafat was
who was the leader of who?
Palestinian,
okay.
the PLO.
The PLO.
They were called the PLO then, Palestinian Liberation Organization.
Okay, because that's when I grew up, they were called the PLO. Okay, so it was at Camp David here in the United States. And then what happens in this meeting?
So Barak offered Arafat a Palestinian state. He offered him all of Gaza and 94% of the West Bank. That's like half of Israel given away. Arafat said no.
These were 3 more no's.
And Arafat said not only no, he said there will be no peace until the Jew has been exterminated from the land.
And what was Bill Clinton's quote?
That Arafat was here for 14 days, and he said no to everything he was offered, and he was offered basically everything.
Wow.
Israel tried again to make peace.
Okay, so that was the early 2000s. Is there anything from then until October 7th, 1993?
In 2008, Israel tried again. Ehud Omar basically went further than Ehud Barak.
And he was the prime minister of Israel in 2008.
He not only offered all that, but the Gaza and 94% of the West Bank, he offered the additional land. He expanded the offer to include even more than any of the others. And Arafat was dead then, but Mahmoud Abbas, who's still the current leader of the Palestinians, said no. He turned down the deal. So again, at least 5 times Israel has offered peace for land. Everybody talks about Israel. Israel needs to give land away for peace. They have tried. They've tried over and over again. It's Israel is not the problem in this. They need to stop fighting. I totally agree with that. But the world needs to know that Israel has bent over backwards and gone out of their way to give land away that they really shouldn't even have to give away because they want it as a spoil of war.
We just want to wrap up in this section of the history of events with Israel and the prophecies, because once again, just tying it back to why is this important for us as Christians? Well, like we said before, the prophetic things that have come true are astounding. Statistically, even if you're not a believer, it's pretty incredible. And also that God's doing something for a purpose. You can see throughout history, you can see through the prophecies, and you can see when you read the word and you compare, like, wow, that happened. And when these things happen in our day and time, it's particularly noteworthy. It gets our attention to go, okay, Lord, what are you up to and how can we partner with you? So again, I just want to say, like, prophecy is to encourage and exhort and sometimes warn us out of his loving kindness. And he also places significance on what we, the church, are supposed to do, to live each day as if it were our last, to love the one in front of us, to evangelize, to basically obey the Great Commission. So we just want to leave you guys with that no matter what you agree or disagree with in this, we still all feel called to do the exact same thing we always have, live each day as if it's our last, and to go into the world and share the gospel.
And then one thing to add to that. So, all of this, why does it matter? Because we see all these events happening, like Pam mentioned. We see prophecy being fulfilled in modern times. And other prophecies we haven't talked about that have been fulfilled in our modern times. Jesus made some very strong statements in some of his prophetic words that he said, but one thing that stands out to me in particular, Jesus said, when you begin to see all of these things, and he lays that out in his Olivet Discourse, when you begin to see all of these things, what things? Wars and rumors of wars. We've seen that. Pestilence, plagues, all these things earthquakes in diverse places. I could go through them all. But he says, when you begin to see these things, what does he say? Get afraid and go hide in the closet and, go, buy a bunch of
Start prepping?
food and become a prepper? No, that's not what he says. He says, look up, lift up your head. Why? Because the Antichrist is coming? Well, yes, he is coming, but doesn't matter. Jesus said, lift up your head because your redemption draws near.
Amen. That's so good. Well, we're going to wrap it up with that. That's a good way to end this podcast. We'll see you next time, and we will be talking about the current state of Israel and the players involved in the war that is happening right now in the Middle East. Thank you, guys. Thanks for joining us on the podcast today. As we journey to know and become the love of God on the earth, we're glad you're with us. Connect with us at shilohcentral.org.